All right, it's 2 minutes after 12 here in Chicago. So I want to welcome you all promptly and thank you for attending this talk. It's noon in Chicago and 8 p.m. in Lviv. So good afternoon, good evening. If you'd like to, as you're getting settled in the Zoom space, you want to drop us a note in the chat and let us know where you're Zooming in from. That will be interesting for us to know, just give us a sense of our shared multiple transnational spaces. My name is Anne Aiken-Moss. I am an assistant professor in the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures at the University of Chicago. And I want to thank very warmly Ana Elena Torres for organizing this talk and for the Comparative Literature Department and series for sponsoring the talk. And of course, I want to thank our speaker, Oksana Kis, for sharing her knowledge with us. Oksana Kis is a feminist historian and anthropologist, a head of the Department of Social Anthropology and a leading research fellow at the Institute of Ethnology at the National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine in Lviv. She obtained her academic degree, the Kandidat Nauk, the equivalent of a US PhD, from Ivan Krypyakevich Institute of Ukrainian Studies, the National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine in 2002. In April 2018, she completed her habilitation, the Dr. Nauk degree. Since 2010, she serves as a president of the Ukrainian Association for Research in Women's History. She's also a founder and vice president of the Ukrainian Oral History Association. In 2014 to 2020, she was the editor-in-chief of the academic website Ukraina Moderna, and she's also a member of the editorial board of Aspasia, the International Yearbook of Central, Eastern, and Southeastern European Women's and Gender History. Really great journal and resource. She was elected to the Scientific Council of the National Research Foundation of Ukraine in 2018. Professor Kis has authored 2 books, and my apologies for mutilating the Ukrainian titles, but I'll do my very best. I'm working on it. She's authored 2 books, Жінка в традиційній українській культурі, The Women in Traditional Ukrainian Culture of the mid-19th to the early 20th century. That came out from Lviv in 2008 and had a second edition in 2012. And Українки в Guлагу, Вижити значить перемоти, published in 2017 with a revised edition in 2020. Its English version, Survival as Victory, Ukrainian Women in the Gulag, was published in the Harvard series in Ukrainian Studies from Harvard University Press, and it was awarded the Translated Book Prize from the Peterson Literary Fund in December 2021. This book was also recently included in a list of the 30 most significant books of Ukrainian independence by the Ukrainian Book Institute. And I invite you to take a look at the website of the Ukrainian Institute. It's a relatively new institution, really interesting, doing interesting work. Professor Kis also edited and co-edited several volumes, including the award-winning book Ukrainsky Жінки в горнилі модернізації, Ukrainian Women in the Crucible of Modernization in 2017. Dr. Kis is a recipient of several academic awards, including Fulbright and a Shklar Research Fellowship at the Ukrainian Research Institute in 2007. She's taught at Columbia University, University of Alberta, the Free Ukrainian University, Ukrainian Catholic University, and the Ivan Franko National University of Lviv. Her areas of expertise include Ukrainian women's history, feminist anthropology, oral history, and gender transformations in post-socialist countries. Her current research focuses on everyday lives of Ukrainian refugees in the displaced persons camps in post-World War II Europe, a topic, unfortunately, with a lot of resonances today. So I'm very pleased to welcome you, Dr. Kis, and thank you for joining us here via Zoom, and thank you all for attending.
Thank you for this introduction. I'm very glad to be here. That's an honor for me to share my research with such a wide international audience. I'll be talking about the issue which I would say resonates very much in present day events in Ukraine, and I find actually many parallels and many comparisons could be made about women's ways and strategies of survival and coping with extreme circumstances, using some elements of normative femininity, of traditional femininity as survival tools and techniques. Let me share my screen with you so you can see some pictures, some documentary pictures, some crafts handmade by women imprisoned in the Gulag, Ukrainian political prisoners back in 1940s and 50s, and some quotations from their testimonies, memoirs, and oral historical interviews. Just a moment, I'll try to share the screen. While I'll be speaking, you can read and see some of those. I'm sorry, I'm not very good with technologies. So, yeah. Yeah. So speaking about the Gulag, some general information. The Gulag was a penitentiary institution and at the same time a repressive institution in the Soviet Union. It was established in 1929 and existed till the late 1950s. It consisted of almost 30,000 separate units of different size and different types, including camps, prisons, stations, all kinds of detachments, small and bigger ones. Those were dispersed all over the Soviet Union, and the great share of those detachments were located in the regions of the Soviet Union, which were less populated with very harsh climate conditions. And exactly there, those stations, camps and divisions were located. The number of prisoners of the Gulag is difficult to calculate, and actually scholars who are doing this kind of research, they offer different estimates because the Gulag statistic is not really very reliable, and the number would vary from 25 to 30 million people who went through the Gulag, who were at certain point imprisoned there. The number of that is even more difficult to estimate, and the numbers would actually vary from about 2 million, Russian scholars would estimate the lowest numbers, up to 13 million, according to some other researchers. More or less adequate number would be suggested by the American scholar Golf Alexopoulos, for instance, offered the number about 6 million people who actually died in the Gulag, who were the victims of the Gulag. In my research, I focus on the period in 1940s and early 30s. And that's the period where the Gulag demography has changed substantially. So the share of political prisoners, the share of Ukrainians, and the share of women exactly in that period increased drastically. So the demographic picture of the Gulag has changed substantially to give me the reason to focus on Ukrainian women political prisoners exactly in that period. Today, I'm going to share some of the ideas which come from my wider research, and as was already said, those are presented in my books. That's exactly the same text, only in Ukrainian and in English, translated by a very talented translator, Lydia Volansky, and I'm really grateful for her work. My book is based on the analysis of 150 plus women's personal testimonies of different kind. Some of them are very huge autobiographies and memoirs, very short testimonies, handwritten. Some come from oral historical interviews. So those were very different sources, personal testimonies of those who once used to be a political prisoner in the Gulag. The majority of those women are Ukrainian, and mostly from the West Ukrainian region. the majority of them actually have been sentenced for long-term imprisonment in camps and prisons for their real or alleged collaboration with the Ukrainian nationalist underground. So many of them actually were actually very seriously engaged in nationalist movement and the believers of the nationalism. But there are also many stories used in these books from women who come from other parts of Ukraine who were not nationalists and actually were the communist, the very serious communist believers. The others are of other ethnic background, the Jewish women, Russian women, Polish, German, those who once happened to spend several years with Ukrainian women in the Gulag. So their memoirs include quite long and elaborated stories about Ukrainian women. One more thing about the Gulag, probably I have to explain, the main goal of the Gulag as a repressive institution with regard to the political prisoners was actually threefold. On the one hand, the point was to isolate from the society and to punish the political opponents of the Communist Party and the Soviet regime for their political crimes, for disobedience, for their opposition. On the other hand, the point was also to re-educate those renegades, or as they call it, to reforge them, перековать, into the loyal Soviet citizens, to break their will to resist, to destroy their social identities, to level their value system, and actually, eventually convert them into, to subordinate their will and to convert them into the followers of the communist regime. And the third point was actually to exploit the cheap or unpaid slave labor, exploit in terms of economy, Soviet economy. Whatever the case, the goal of a prisoner of the Gulag was twofold. At this, on the one hand, prisoner has to survive physically, to preserve his body from destruction, but on the other hand, she or he had to preserve his personality, herself, to preserve her social identities, to remain the same person and not to be destroyed in terms of personality. In my present day lecture, I'm using the concept of normative femininity, which is a complex of historical and culturally established ideas, norms and practices concerning women, which prevail in a certain society and define the limits and specific characteristics of the appropriate women's appearance and behaviors, activities, social roles, responsibilities, duties, rights, and so on and so forth. In a traditional society, the gendered socialization of girls is framed by the normative femininity, so that it serves as a basis of gender to build up women's gender identities and works as a point of reference for adult women throughout their lives. By performing normative femininity, women could attain the recognition and approval and to become the full-fledged members of society, the respected members of the society. In Ukraine, in the situation which I am describing, the majority of women whose stories are analyzed in my research, those who come from Western Ukraine, who were born more or less in the 20s, in mid-20s, those women grew up in a society which at that time was not a part of the Soviet Union and therefore was not affected, was not the subject of the Soviet-style forced modernization of countryside. So those were very self-aware Ukrainian women, nationally aware, good Christians, women who actually grew up in a very traditional society which operated within a very traditional framework of gender order. So they interiorized the entire complex of ideas and norms about what a good Ukrainian woman is supposed to look like, have to behave, what she's supposed to do, what would be her duties and responsibilities, and so on and so forth. So at that time, the gender script would include proper feminine appearance, so everyone would be required or expected to look properly as a woman, but she also would be expected to be a good housekeeper, a universal caregiver, practicing faithful Christian, and also possess basic skills in some folk crafts. So in my lecture, I will try to show how those constituents of Ukrainian normative femininity actually turned into survival resources and techniques, helping women to relatively efficiently withstand the destructive effects of the Gulag regime on their bodies, minds, and social identities in the Gulag. And I'll start with the appearance. Sorry. Actually, from the very first minute upon arrest, every arrested woman immediately realized that she is not treated as a woman any longer, that she is not a woman in a normal traditional term, that she is defenseless in front of the repressive machinery. And at the very beginning, all the many attributes, many markers of her femininity, the external markers were removed. So during the first interrogations, some elements of her garment have been taken away as a potentially dangerous, like belts or pins. And women, many women in their memoirs recall with bitterness that very moment when they started to transform from being a woman into becoming a prisoner, mostly perceive it as a sexless human mass in general. So women, imprisoned women usually were given this prisoner's uniform, which they perceive it as something absolutely ugly. You can see the samples of that uniform. Those are the real clothing women, former political prisoners, preserved and then donated to the museums. And now they are exhibited in Ukrainian museums. Usually that prisoner's uniform was very baggy, shapeless, off-size, made of very brutal fabric, dark colored. In many instances, it wasn't actually new, it was worn out, or quite often the used military uniform with some marks, spots of blood, and even through the marks of shots. So it was clear that that military uniform was taken off of some wounded or probably killed soldiers. So women felt very bad about their appearance because they didn't look like women any longer. Their outlook was completely grotesque, and they felt like they are disappearing with that clothing. They are not women any longer, and they were also stripped of their names. That was the way to actually erase their personalities and their gender identities, which to some extent are manifested through the appearance, through the clothing outfit. So with bitterness, always they recall those numbers because it was so offensive to them to become just a number, not a person any longer with a name. Women had to wear whatever was available because there was a permanent shortage of clothing and footwear in the Gulag, and the need was usually satisfied to some they covered to some 30 to 45%. The demand was covered. So women always suffered from cold because in harsh weather, it was not sufficient for them. I mean, the clothing, so they had to put on whatever was available, many layers, and therefore they looked sometimes in a very strange way. They didn't remind women any longer in that clothing, but they actually tried whatever they could to do whatever they could to amend that very strange clothes to somehow make it fit the female body shape. So they tried to somehow amend and the clothing to make it look more feminine, to change it in a way. In many instances, women recall that they were trying to preen themselves by adding some decorative elements to this very ugly outfit, by adding a white collar. In many, many memoirs, so you can find this mention of a white collar. Women were like obsessed with that white collar, and one of them actually explained that white collar, I will show you some pictures later on, was a kind of fence to make that ugly prisoner uniform, to make a barrier between their bodies and the ugly uniform, somehow to distance themselves to that prisoner's reality. So they tried to add some little embroidery, some little detail to make it look more feminine. Surprisingly, despite the lack of hygiene in the Gulag camps and prisons, and you probably know that the prisoners were taken to the bath only 2 or 3 times per month at best, to the general bath, and it was quite difficult to maintain the body hygiene, and sanitary conditions in the barracks were quite often awful, and the lice and fleas were widespread in the Gulag. So it was extremely difficult to keep the hair in a proper order. It would be much easier for a person to shave her head to prevent lice and fleas and so on. But on the pictures taken immediately upon release, upon women left the camps, were set free, they usually took the memorial pictures, and on those pictures we can see women with hair dresses, and many of them kept somehow their long hair, so they took care whatever was the price of this effort. In many memoirs, we can find also remarks that women tried to make the hairdo for the court sessions to look properly in front of the court at trial, because that was a very important moment in their life, and they tried to look properly as women. Women also, when they prepared to the moment of release, to be set free, and especially after the Stalin's death and after the wave of camps uprising in 1953-54, the camp regime was a little bit loosened, and women started to be paid little money for the work they performed, and they started to save some miserable money to buy some cheap fabric and to sew some skirts and dresses, preparing themselves to become free women. So they wanted to step out of the camp and to become the normal women as they used to be. And those pictures, we can see pictures taken after their release from the camp. They usually feature those women in actually probably quite modest, but still very feminine clothing with dresses and skirts. And you can see those white collars all over the place, the very popular element of women's outfit at that time. So women really wanted to leave that prisoners appears back in the camp. What impressed me in some memoirs, I found the remarks about the perfumes. One would say that what would be the point to get perfume in the camp where people actually were trying to survive. They were starving, they were sick, they were exhausted because of the back-breaking labor, because of absolutely inadmissible living conditions and lack of medical assistance. Why would those women be interested in having the perfumes? And Nadia Surovtseva, one of probably the most famous memoirist from the Gulag, actually explained the role of the perfume. For many women, that was a reminder of a normal life. They really wanted to get something to hang on, to have this point of reference, to build around or to preserve or to maintain their gender identity. So the perfume was exactly that small, very small, but very significant element, reminder of a free life, of a normal life before the arrest, before imprisonment. So they wanted to maintain that connection to a normalcy, to preserve that normalcy, at least in this way. Another way to practice their gender identities, to perform their gender identities in the Gulag, was housekeeping, to keep the barracks in proper order. It was not an easy task to accomplish because, as I said, it was difficult in terms of hygiene. Women were not given any soap, they were lacking even water because of the cold. Even the water given them in the bucket would freeze over the night, turned into ice, so they couldn't even wash their hands or their face. So it was quite difficult to maintain hygiene. But women were actually trying to treat that housing, the barrack, and the barrack, by the way, that was a big space which hosted from several dozens to several hundreds of women at the moment who were staying on the bunk beds, two-level bunk beds, with minimal beddings, actually, if any, quite cold, with poor ventilation, with almost non-existent heating. So it was very difficult to breathe there. It was almost dark there, extremely cold, full of lice and mice and so on and so forth. It was difficult to perceive that housing. It didn't remind any normal housing women used to live in, not a village cottage, not a regular flat or an apartment in the town. But since that was the only shelter women had for the years to come, they started to treat it as a normal habitual place and tried to convert it into a semblance of their home, into substitute of their home, and tried hard to make it somehow cozy and comfortable as much as they could. So they tried to keep it clean as much as they could, and to also to decorate it. And usually they decorated that space with embroidery, especially Ukrainian women and women representatives of the other nation usually mentioned that specifically, that it was easy to recognize the barrack where the Ukrainians stay because of the embroidery, which was everywhere. Although in very modest one, very simple embroidery because of the lack of resources, of course, but still women were trying to do their best to decorate. But another point was that women were kind of obsessed to put everything in order, to somehow to maintain hygiene as much as they can, but also to keep and to embellish the barrack as much as they can in given circumstances. And many women actually emphasize specifically in their memoirs, in oral historical interviews, that cleanliness was paramount for them. And the scholars of the Gulag would say that that was a way to somehow counterbalance the chaos of the Gulag, the chaos their life was turned to. They were uprooted from their normal social environment, from their normal life, from separated from their families, and their lives were falling apart. That was a total mess. So they tried to somehow to bring certain order in their lives and to create this semblance of normalcy within their living space, to continue to be the normal women who behave in a normal way, who continue to perform the regular women's chores day by day. So they are the normal women, albeit in a completely abnormal situation, but they are trying to stay the same, to continue to be the same. And that obsession with cleanliness and trying to make their barracks a bit homey, a substitute of a home, would be the manifestation of their effort to remain women. Also, the Christian faith played an extremely important role for imprisoned women. As I said, many of them came from the Western Ukraine, and Christian faith and related practices were quite an essential part of their regular life, and they were not prepared to give up their faith in imprisonment. Despite all the prohibitions and punishment, they continued to pray. And not only in person, like those private, intimate prayers, but they prayed also jointly. And they also arranged group prayers and so-called divine masses, divine liturgies. So first of all, one has to remember that women felt quite feeble in front of this powerful and merciless repressive machinery, and there was nobody to ask for justice or for help. So they turned their all their requests to the superior just, to the Jesus Christ and to Virgin Mary, whom they considered to be a special advocate in women's issues, and they actually relied upon her patronage. And in many women's memoirs, we can find stories about actually all kinds of miracles or prophetic dreams where Virgin Mary played a central role. But women also arranged those improvised liturgies. They also produced handmade items for personal spiritual usage, which were prohibited in the Gulag, and during the regular searches, those were taken away and destroyed, and the owners would be punished. But women continued to produce those items and beads and crosses made out of the black bread, handmade. And they also embroidered the icons, and you can see actually many samples, many actual embroidered prisoners' icons survived and are preserved now in the museums and in private archives. And here you can see also absolutely unique artifact. This is a prayer book which survived the Gulag. It was extremely difficult to get, to procure, to have it, and to preserve it, because the searches were aimed directly to find any printed material. So anything made of paper would be destroyed immediately. How that woman preserved that book, I don't know. But after my second edition of my book in Ukrainian was published, a great daughter of that Yulia Zayets contacted me on the Facebook and informed me that she has some family memorabilia, and her grandmother was imprisoned, and here is the prayer book, and she sent me a couple of pictures so you can see it, but that is a unique item, I would say. So also about the Virgin Mary, as I said, there was a kind of cult of Virgin Mary, of a Divine Mother of God in the Gulag, and a very huge number of embroidered, handmade, very small icons survived, and women always mention Our Lady and her guardianship and her patronage as their only hope while being in the Gulag, surviving the tortures, interrogations in the remand prisons, and later on in the Gulag. They asked her for help, protection, to survive, to endure all the hardships with dignity. And the group prayers, women arranged those improvised liturgies, I said, for holidays and quite often on Sundays. And what is special about those improvised liturgies? That was all women's milieu, right? The women were kept in the Gulag camps and zones separately from men. So there were no priests among women, obviously. But the point is that women were so much eager to attend liturgy, so they tried to reconstruct the liturgy, and they took over the role of priest and deacon and tried to restore the divine service step by step from their memory, or if they had this prayer book. And they took over the roles of a priest and a deacon and actually conducted the liturgy. So, and the other women attended, and for them, no matter how artificial it might look now, but at that moment for them it was a real divine service and very important for boosting their spirit, for supporting them morally. And what is interesting that paradoxically, actually, in their normal life before arrest, none of them, be it like Orthodox Christian or Roman Catholic Christian or Greek Catholic Christian, none of those women would ever have any chance of church leadership, of a pastorate, of playing a role of a priest. And only in the Gulag, at the moment when they were deprived of all the rights and all their resources and opportunities were restricted to the maximum, they actually had this chance to become, to practice, to have this experience of church leadership. This is amazing because those women, they were quite religious ones, and they were aware, and they speak in their memoirs that they understand it wasn't against the church rules, they were transgressing the church rules. But at that moment for them, their faith weighted more than the rules and regulations of the church as an institution. So they actually served as priests. They also celebrated Christian holidays like Easter and Christmas. That was extremely important for them. And in Ukrainian tradition, women play extremely important role in all those rituals, traditions, and customs surrounding the holidays, not the actually the religious part, the church part of the ritual, but whatever happens at home. And there are rich customs and rituals, including the holiday meals, specific ritual meals cooked for the holiday. So women in the Gulag, of course, it was absolutely prohibited, but women usually describe with great enthusiasm how they prepared to the celebration a few weeks in advance. They tried to stock up some food stuff and to prepare some elements and decoration and everything in order to reconstruct the ritual as close to the normal script as possible with all the elements in place, albeit some of those elements would be fake, right? Like the Easter eggs made of clay and painted, but still present on the holiday table, on the Easter table. And they celebrated all those rituals, pretending this is a normal way to celebrate. I would say that by this kind of activity, which mobilized women emotionally and actually it contributed greatly to their solidarity because they tried to do it together, jointly. They also, for them, it was also another way to reconnect to their native culture, to virtually to reconnect, to transgress those, to overcome those huge distances which separated them from their homeland, and to become like at that ritual moment, to reunite with their community, with their family in this ritual sacred moment of the holiday. And that was also the way, another way to practice their gender identities, to perform their gender roles as housekeepers, the women who are able to prepare properly the holiday and to celebrate properly, no matter how fake all those elements could be. They try to make it as close as possible. Another very popular pastime in the Gulag was singing. Singing together in groups was extremely popular. Every woman who shared her memoir of the Gulag mentioned that singing was so important, and there were songs besides of those folk songs singing together, but also the prisoner songs they created jointly. And they sang everywhere, and the Gulag administration and the guards always perceived that to be a very serious transgression of the camp's rules and regulations, and women caught on singing together quite often were punished. And the punishment usually was to disperse women, to send them to different camps, because singing, this group singing was perceived as another way to show the solidarity. So women created some groups, they established some stronger bonds than allowed in the Gulag. But the idea was to separate people, to disperse them, and to prevent any actually any solidarity in the Gulag, in order to prevent any group resistance in the Gulag. But women used to sing, and beside of that effect of strengthening women's feeling of belonging to the group, to the national collective, but also to the specific group of their fellow inmates, it was also another way to mentally escape the Gulag, to return to their home, to recall their happy life before the arrest, and to dream about the happy life after the release. So it was the way to remain mentally free. And many women actually testify that by singing songs, they felt that the Gulag regime cannot control them. They are free in their souls. Another extremely controversial and very painful for women experience, a specific gendered experience of the imprisonment, just a moment, was motherhood. Many women actually experienced their motherhood while being arrested and sentenced to long-term imprisonment. Some of them were arrested being pregnant. The others were arrested with babies in hands. But also some women get pregnant while in the imprisonment for different reasons, many because of rape, but also there are cases where women deliberately, they really wanted to become mothers because, and they explained that decision because they actually were aware that so many years of imprisonment are ahead of them, and the most likely they won't survive. Or even if they survive, they will be old and their health will be destroyed and they won't be able to have a baby. So they really wanted to experience the motherhood. And it wasn't that important who is the father, but they just wanted to have a baby, to have someone to love, to care. And they were prepared to go through all those hardships of motherhood behind bars, which was had nothing in common with normal, regular practices of mothering. And of course, those babies either brought to the Gulag from freedom after due to arrest, or those who were born in the Gulag after some time, usually after 18 to 24 months, when they were kept by the certain camp in a special, special unit for babies. Usually it was called children home or otherwise like orphanage. Those small kids were taken away and sent to different orphanages all over the Soviet Union. At best, those kids could be given to the relatives of an imprisoned woman, but that was a very difficult in terms of bureaucracy related, and that specific relative had to come in person to the specific camp and to take the baby physically by hand. So it was rather exception than a normal practice. And many women actually lost their kids in the Gulag. Many babies died because of very poor conditions they were kept and very poor health care. And some babies were actually then retrieved, and some of them actually reunited with their mothers. And you have here a quote from Alexandra Blavatsky, who shared her memory of meeting her daughter Vera after a few years of separation, and the little girl didn't recognize her mother and didn't want to stay with her, and she spoke Russian language and didn't understand Ukrainian language at that moment. So it was a very traumatic, very painful moment of reunion, and it took that specific woman, Alexandra Blavatsky, many years to reestablish their connection, their family. And as I said, many children have died and the death rate was very high. And there is still that memorial cemetery, Mami's cemetery, by the village of Dolinka in Karaganda Oblast in Kazakhstan. There was a big women's camp nearby. And because so many kids died, there is a huge cemetery with most of those graves unmarked properly. But those mothers who were in the Gulag and whose kids were left behind with their family members in their home cities and villages, they tried to maintain some connection, some contact with their kids. They felt, to some extent, they felt guilty for not being able to take proper care of their kids. And they tried to send those kids some messages, some blessings. And here we have some of those embroideries women send back to their kids. They usually feature either an angel who is entitled for guardianship for kids, or a Virgin Mary who is also somehow trusted with a request to take care of those small kids, to be a good supervisor for them, as long as the mother is away and not able to perform her maternal duties. And I would say this kind of remote practice of remote motherhood is also very remarkable for maintaining gender identity, of which motherhood plays a kind of central role in the traditional culture. And I also want to, I am afraid I am already out of time, but I also wanted to speak a little bit about embroidery, which obtained unprecedented popularity in the Gulag, despite the very fact that there was no resources for embroidery. Neither time was that, but also the needles and the scissors were completely prohibited. Any sharp item was prohibited. So women had to be quite resourceful in terms of using whatever is available, and usually they used the fish bones instead of needles, and they used the sharpened pieces of cans or glass to cut the fabric, and they pulled out threads from worn out clothes to be used for embroidery. So there are many samples of prisoners' embroidery. It survived exactly because of the material it was made of, because it was quite relatively easy to hide a piece of fabric somewhere in the clothing. It was not that easy for guards to find it during the searches. And the embroidery as such is quite simple, I would say, quite modest. That's obvious because they used these scraps and of worn out clothing to embroider on. But what is remarkable that the embroidery was not the function of the embroidery, the meaning of the embroidery in imprisonment has changed dramatically. It wasn't the artistic practice any longer. It was something different because every piece of embroidery was made not for a woman herself, but as a gift for her fellow inmate. It was usually something given to another person, to a friend. So we can see that almost each embroidery has this inscription, the name of an addressee and the name of the author, with some other words like for good memory, to keepsake, and so on and so forth. Those embroideries given to one another to establish the social ties, to strengthen their connection. I would say that these embroideries, the small serviettes, embroidered savers, no matter how modest they were in terms of aesthetic value, they had a very strong and very important symbolic value and social value, and they worked like a token of trust. Like I would say, even it was a kind of membership ticket or something like that, to show another person that you are one of us, to belong to our community. We trust you. We are together, and this exchange of embroidery fulfill this function, social function. And I would say that this idea that embroidery functioned as in a different way in imprisonment is supported by another specific type of embroidery I found in different places. Here you can see three different artifacts I found in different museums. They come from different places, but the peculiarity is that they look very strange. They don't look like a normal embroidered, serviette. The one in the left lower corner, it is on the cover of my book in Ukrainian, comes from the Memorial Museum, which is located in the infamous Lonsky prison, remand prison in the city of Lviv. And this specific artifact was embroidered jointly by female prisoners of that remand prison during the period from November 1945 until March 1946. And it includes the cell numbers, the initials, some dates, and also small decorative patterns added by different female prisoner of that prison inmate, female inmates. So I would say it is a kind of a list of female prisoners, imprisoned women, from that specific prison. This embroidery represents this community of imprisoned women. And on the right lower corner, you can see it's a fragment of a much longer embroidered towel, which represent the same way the community of female prisoners of another camp. And this towel is now kept, it is preserved in the museum, local history museum in the city of Vinnytsia. And on the top, you can see it's a fragment of a promotional video presenting the exhibit, which is currently on in the memorial in Moscow. And this is an exhibit titled Material or Fabric, Material, Textile. And this is an exhibit about women, arts and crafts and other objects made of textile, made of fabric in the Gulag camps and prisons. And this is the towel which I found there, like just watching that promotional video. Of course, I had no chance, and I don't plan to go to Moscow to see the exhibit, but obviously this is exactly the same type of embroidery. This is exactly the same type of embroidered list of prisoners, exactly the same way to represent the female community of a specific camp.
Oksana,
Women's solidarity.
May I interrupt you one short minute in case there are any of our listeners who have to leave precisely at 1. I want to let you finish your talk because I'm learning such an incredible amount. But if there are audience members on the call that have to leave at 1, I just wanted to make sure that before you go, you knew that Professor Kies is also giving another Zoom lecture, and I take it will probably be from it will extend some of this quite incredible material, this object history of the women's experience of the Gulag at Washington University, and that lecture is entitled Beauty That Saved Their World, Ukrainian Women's Arts and Crafts in the Soviet Gulag. And that is sponsored by the University of Washington. And I believe someone will put the link to register for that talk into the chat. So I just wanted to make sure that no one missed seeing that if they had to leave precisely at 1. And I'll turn it back to you. And I think I can stay on for until at least a quarter after, because I'd like to give people the opportunity to ask you some questions. And I have some questions.
Okay, sure.
But I'd like to
I'm coming to the closing.
Wonderful. I'll turn it back to you.
Okay. Actually, this is probably the last, but the most important point to me, the women's solidarity, which turned to be the most efficient survival strategy in the Gulag. What I observed in all the memoirs, all the testimonies of women, which I had the chance to read and to explore, that women always emphasize it, that it was extremely important to feel that sisterhood in the Gulag. They felt that their fellow inmates supported them in all possible different ways, both materially sharing clothing, supporting them physically with food and so on and so forth, but also showing empathy and compassion and supporting them emotionally in the darkest moment when they had these suicidal thoughts because of despondency, because of despair, because of lack of hope and so on and so forth. So women's solidarity and women's friendship and mutual support group were extremely important for survival. And many women actually established the kind of bonds in the imprisonment, which happened to be much stronger, much more intimate than the relationship with their real relatives. Women recalling the moments they spent time together in the camps, women would call them with these designations, the family designations, like sisters, mothers, aunties, grannies, and so on and so forth. They felt like very close, like real family, and they relied upon support of one another. They procured resources and consumed resources together. They healed wounds of one another. They took all possible care of one another and survived together, sharing everything they had. And they remained friends for the decades afterwards. They exchanged visits and letters and phone calls for the entire life. So they became the real families for each other. And this is a decisive moment for me, because what I see now in Ukraine, when we observe this bloody war, how women's ethic of care works in the situation of extreme violence, in the situation which are extraordinary, when women try to establish those networks of care and provide also emotional labor, working to comfort one another, those who are in distress, those who are in depression, and trying to help physically, to find shelter, to feed people, and so on and so forth. And that was one of those practices I find the most important in the Gulag practices and women's experiences of imprisonment, which helped them enormously to survive and to actually to remain women. And I would say that despite the fact that in traditional feminist thought, the normative femininity is criticized usually as something which is limiting women's opportunities, is restrictive in terms of women's self-fulfillment. But when it comes to the situation of extreme circumstances, when the rights and resources and opportunities are extremely limited, it turned out that this very rigid substance, the normative femininity, remains a kind of a solid ground on which women could survive, on which women could hold on, and to preserve their gender identities and also their Christian identities, their national identities, as we could say from all those practices which are somehow related to their normative femininity as well. Thank you for your attention, and sorry for taking so much time. I'll be happy to answer a question or to listen to your comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking Professor Kies. Oh, I guess I can do this with this icon here, which doesn't make as much sound on Zoom, but thank you. That was incredibly illuminating, especially given, I think, especially for my Anglo-American Slavist audiences here who probably don't think in national terms about the experience of the Gulag. So this was an incredibly, a real gift that you've given us to give us this look, intricate look into the details of Ukrainian women's life in the Gulag. There's a handful of questions in the chat that I want to make sure get covered before I open it up more generally. A question about the, let's see, Kate Copy asks both for your contact information, which went by very quickly in the last slide. So maybe we can drop that into the chat so that people can ask you questions directly. And then Kate also asks if the images of embroidery are included in your book, in either version of your book, in both the Ukrainian and the Harvard University Press version. Wonderful.
Yes, all the images are there, and in that English version, they are in big size, in full color, so they are very well, very clear.
Wonderful. Let me invite people to use the raise hand function if they would like to. You may also, if you have a question that's an immediate follow-up to another question, you can put the number 1 to raise your hand in the chat if you can't find the raise hand button. But if you have an immediate follow-up to a question that has just been answered, you can put the number 2 into the chat box. This is a Zoom innovation that is very helpful for facilitating conversation. And while people are thinking of other questions, oh yes, please, Oksana, please go ahead and ask the first question.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. Thank you very much for your lecture. It was so, nourishing. Thank you. I am looking forward to reading your book. I'm from Ukraine, excuse me, but I will speak English so that people understand me. Thank you. Again, before I start with my questions, I have 2 of them. The first is about trust. This is a matter of specific interest to me because I listen to people like who underwent through Soviet repression, but they were not personally present in Gulag. So, for instance, their members of their families were called enemy of people, and like father was sent to prison, and the rest of the family was deported, or the rest of the family stayed in Dnipro, wherever. I'm from the east of Ukraine, and this is the matter that sounds most, how to say, no, it catches my ear, so to say. This is very specific, that people speak about their mistrust, that they had to rely on themselves only because they couldn't trust one another. I had a lot of stories. I major in psychology, so that it is understandable. I heard a lot of stories when their close neighbors or their members of their families could write a report to secret police because of envy, because of different reasons, but still. And this brought terrible mistrust within even close circles. And that's why when I listen to these stories of union, right, of this feeling of communion, unitedness, it as if this is a kind of different discourse, so to say, and how you can explain, if you can, a couple of words. And I have one more also. This is about this accessibility of the resource, of femininity, of religion. From your observations and from your experience, what do you think? To whom it was accessible, and what women could not make use of it? So, for instance, they all came out of religious families, right? They all were women, but still some could make use of it and some couldn't. That's it. And again, thank you very much. And for your books and for your articles, just complete respect and delight. Thank you very much.
Thank you for those very inspiring questions. I'll try to ask. I will probably speculate because it wasn't that clear from the testimonials I used, but I assume that this is exactly because of the regional peculiarity, because the majority of women whose stories I analyzed, they come from this nationalist milieu. And they perceived themselves from the very beginning, they perceived it in opposition to the Soviet regime. So for them, they were like one community which opposed the Soviet regime, personified in the Gulag system. So they felt they are continued the struggle against this regime. There are us, who are Ukrainian nationalist women, and other women who joined that group, although they were not nationalist at the beginning. But slowly they started to share those ideas. So they were converted into the nationalism. So that was a unity of people of the same mindset, I would say, the same, shared same ideology, and therefore they trusted one another, I believe. They felt they are representing one group which was oppressed by the Soviet regime, and the Gulag administration or the guards and the others represented the opposition. While there was also, in many instances, they describe all kinds of tensions between women of different ethnic background. I mean, Polish women or Russian women whom they didn't trust, of course, and they felt like kind of enmity towards them. But they also describe how they tried to they not tried, but there was a kind of sentiment of commonality of prisoners. There was a kind of this community of prisoners, and that shared identity of being the prisoners of the Gulag. So they tried to not show their conflicts in front of the Gulag administration. So they tried to stay together and to maintain a kind of not a friendship, of course, but a kind of a normal relationship with women of other nationalities with whom they didn't feel like comfortable enough. What comes to the other question, which was, could you remind me what was the second question, please?
It was to whom it was accessible, these resources of being feminine, of being religious. Like, I believe
it. Okay, I'll try. I believe it was it was about almost about everyone. So women describe not only their own practices, but they also speak about other women doing specific things, like having a silk shawl. There was a women representing Ukrainian intelligentsia who was an elderly woman, and she was, of course, in a miserable physical condition, but she was trying to somehow to preen herself and to look like an elegant woman. So they used whatever was available, and they used all kinds of, materials coming from the trash bin usually to make their underwear, to make the embroideries of whatever scraps they found. So I wouldn't say that was accessible or not accessible, but those women, they just practiced that, they just did it. And they describe it with such an enthusiasm, with such a, pride. So it feels like they were happy to do that. That was important for them. They spent so much time and place in their memoirs describing these activities. So I have to think that it was something really significant for them in their Gulag everyday life. So not only that back-breaking work or hunger or diseases or injuries and so on and so forth, all kinds of humiliation and violence they suffered, but they try to describe in very detail those bright moments, those moments of joy, and like creativity, like this women's solidarity, this kind of sisterhood, sharing their stories, and so on and so forth. That was important for them, and they described it in details.
I have a follow-up question about the sisterhood and the way the sisterhood among the women prisoners fell out along national lines. I mean, to what extent did this reinforce national affinities and communities, and to what extent did it bridge out and then, form a larger network?
Most likely, of course, women would affiliate with have this allegiance with their national groups based on their ethnic background. But there were also cases where women of different nations joined Ukrainian Ukrainian groups because they were lonely, they were like single representatives of their nationality. For instance, in my lecture in my book, I quote from Wally Schliess. She was a German woman who spent several years with Ukrainian women in the Gulag. She was the only German woman in that barrack. And she was accepted, otherwise she wouldn't survive. She didn't understand Russian language and she wouldn't manage, she wouldn't be able to cope there. But Ukrainian women took her into their group and helped her to survive. And then she was released prematurely because of some treaties between the Soviet Union and Western allies. And she was released relatively quickly, and she promised her Ukrainian girlfriends that once she is in Germany, she will describe all the life in the Gulag, everyday life, and she will make it public, so the entire world would know about the Gulag and what women are actually experiencing there. And she wrote her memoir and she sent it to the Ukrainian National Women's League of America, to their journal Our Life, Наше життя, and they translated and published that in pieces in several issues. So that was the way it became available to Ukrainians. So I read it in Ukrainian language, actually, although it was written in German originally, but she was the one who described in detail what Ukrainian women used to do in the camps, because she was a part of it. And there were other stories by Polish women, Barbara Skarha, who describes Ukrainians in detail. And initially she had all kinds of prejudices towards Ukrainians, and she was not, she had this like negative attitude at the beginning, but after she spent several months with them, she started to see positive aspects in their community. And she is describing all of that in her quite elaborated memoir, and it was also translated into Ukrainian. And some other also representatives of the other nations, like very famous Evgenia Ginsburg, who published her memoir quite early, and it was translated into English. She also speaks about Ukrainians with fondness because she observed them closely and she became friends with many of them. So it was both ways. There were cases of enmity and conflicts, of course. It would be strange if there would be no conflicts in given circumstances. But what is amazing that women, especially Ukrainian women, they wouldn't focus on those tensions, on those conflicts, on those confrontations. They would mention that there were issues, there were problems, but in general, we became friends, we lived in peace, we tried to respect one another and respect the holidays of one another, especially like Orthodox Christians and Roman Catholic Christians. They tried, to respect the calendar of the holidays, Christian holidays of each other, and so on and so forth. So what is important to me that women in their memoirs, they try to stress these positive moments. And I would say this is important for them exactly because the solidarity, the peace, the harmony helped them to survive. Every conflict would make every group weaker and then decrease their chances for survival. And every piece of solidarity and mutual aid and help and so on would increase their chances to survive.
Thank you. I want to be respectful of everyone's time, and especially that of those of you who are supporting this event. So I will pull it to a close, although I'll leave the, I think perhaps you can assign me the link, Esther, the host duty, so that we can stay on for a few minutes later to chat, but we'll stop the recording. Well, first of all, we'll thank you very much for this rich discussion and send you our very best. Thank you for this moment of intellectual mutual aid to allow us to understand this period of history better, but also to have this connection with you there in Lviv. And so we're sending our very best to you. Thank you, and thank you all for attending. And we'll go ahead and stop the recording now.
Thank you. That was a pleasure for me.